Hello, Matt Roberts with AthleticDirectorU and D1 Ticker at the NCAA headquarters in Indianapolis. Pleased to be joined by VP of Hearing Operations, Naima Stevenson Starks today. Naima, you were previously the Deputy General Counsel and Managing Director of Academic and Membership Affairs. This new role, which I'm going to quote specifically, there's a lot here and I don't want to get it twisted, has been described as the NCAA's primary liaison with the new Independent Accountability Oversight Committee, Infractions Referral Committee, and the Independent Resolution Panel. These new committees, along with a group of independent investigators and advocates, will constitute the complex case unit, beginning their work August 1. Obviously, we are past August 1, but there's a lot there. Unpack it for us, a lot of moving parts. Walk us through your new role and how you will interface with these different groups.
Great. So the new role is exactly that, to work with the independent accountability resolution process, which is all of the components that you just described, but also to work with our existing infractions process. So I have kind of double duty working with this newly created independent structure, but also working to support the offices within the national office that support our existing infraction structure as well. But with the independent structure, the Independent Accountability Oversight Committee has 3 of the newly appointed independent members of the Board of Governors as part of that structure. And they also have the Division I Board of Directors, Chair and Vice Chair, that serve as the Oversight Committee. And that group will sit kind of on top of this new independent structure and have responsibility and oversight for the independent structure.
You've used the word independent a couple of times, and we know now that there are independent members as a part of these structures. I want to talk through specifically how the independent members were vetted and selected, and how you guys worked through perceived or real conflicts of interests within those individuals.
So, and I guess there was some reporting with respect to the complex case unit, and that is just one component of the independent structure. So that you got the oversight committee that kind of sits on top. You have the infractions referral committee, which is not independent in the same way in which we're talking about it, because it's mostly populated by people from the current membership. That has the Division I Council Chair and Vice Chair, a representative from the Committee on Infractions, a representative from the Infractions Appeals Committee, and then one of the independent resolution panel members, which are the independent adjudicators. The complex case unit is, again, one of the 4 components of the independent structure, and that is just the investigators and the advocates that will be presenting cases to the independent resolution panel, who are the independent adjudicators. So there was a lot of focus on the complex case unit and kind of the makeup of that unit. The entities that certain individuals work for, I know the names were listed, and that gave the impression that that was a committee. It is not a committee. It is for each of the cases that are referred to the independent structure, there will be perhaps some additional investigation beyond what the enforcement staff has already done in the existing structure that will have to be completed. And there were 3 firms that were identified that would sort of take the lead on doing that investigation, right, any of the follow-up investigation. And then there will be advocates who, again, are not the decision makers, and they don't really form a committee, but there will be advocates that will then present the case before the independent resolution panel. So that's what those roles are. And there were 3 entities that were identified as potential investigators and 3 entities that were identified as providing the advocates that would actually make the presentation of the allegations to the independent resolution panel.
So the advocates, what sort of training are they receiving from kind of an onboarding process to merge their professional worlds with these roles that they're now filling? What does that process look like?
That's a great question. So the investigators and the advocates both have already gone through an initial orientation. But as you know, our world is quite different from the worlds that most of the folks that are populating all of the different components of the process really come from. So there will have to necessarily be ongoing education efforts for all of them, not just the advocates and the investigators, but the independent adjudicators and even our folks that are serving on our oversight committee, just to make sure that they're abreast to college athletics, which is not generally the world that any of them are coming from.
Right. Can you give us some examples of that initial orientation, what it was comprised of?
Yeah, so the initial orientation for the complex case unit was really designed and operated in large measure by the enforcement staff, since those folks will be the ones that they, as you noted, the processes and the procedures will be the same in this independent structure as they are in the existing structure. So the enforcement staff kind of really spent a lot of time trying to help them understand how the current investigative processes work in the existing structure, because that will have to be, they don't have any additional tools, that don't exist in the existing structure. And then I participated in that training to kind of give an overview of the independent structure. We had folks from our Committee on Infractions staff that support the Committee on Infractions give some information. So it was pretty comprehensive.
Interesting. Expediency and the pace at which many of these cases are adjudicated. Clearly, there's membership within the institutions who will watch this and comment, man, it's taken so long, There's so many steps previously. Will these new processes quicken our pace on that front, and what can member institutions expect on pace of resolution now?
That's a great question. I think that there was some, expectation that things would be faster, perhaps in this new structure. And
everybody wished that.
Right. But I do want to caution, because likely any case that is going to come into the independent structure will have already existed for some period of time in the current structure. So we
may not know the answer for a couple of years.
Correct. Correct. So whatever timing concerns you have with the current structure, and I think that there have been over time, certainly things are getting resolved a little bit more quickly, and we have other mechanisms now like the negotiated resolution. So that helps with expediency. Any case that likely is coming into this independent structure, again, will have already likely existed in the existing structure, and it's not, it will add time as opposed to truncating time, because now this new process will have to get engaged, and people will have to have an opportunity to respond.
Sure.
And so I don't think that the expectation that it will move at a rapid pace is likely realistic.
One specific challenge of the enforcement process that we've all been aware of for years is the lack of subpoena power. I'm curious if there was ever any formal outreach to the FBI, district attorney's office, for there to be any specific relationship to kind of further the reach of the enforcement process. And clearly there's a very high profile number of institutions who are involved in this right now. How would you answer that?
Yeah, so it's a tricky situation to a certain extent, because we are not a state actor, right? So any involvement as a private association that we would have with law enforcement, kind of doing work on our behalf or providing us information, then changes the character of the private association. So that's really where the limitations have been. Certainly if there is information that would otherwise be publicly available through some sort of court proceedings or otherwise, then, we have access to that just like anyone else does. But doing anything that would be under the color of a government action, that would be the case with the FBI or law enforcement or et cetera, that has complications with respect to the NCAA being involved in that way.
The answer sounds like no. We're not even 30 days into this new process officially. You talked about the expediency of cases and how it may not be as quick as people expect initially.
Right.
Are there data points that you're already honed in on that if we sat back down in 3 years that you would expect to be able to metric off of to say, look, here's why it is better?
So one thing, and I, especially since my role as VP of Hearing Operations, as I noted at the outset, is really to work with the existing structure and this new structure. One thing I want to, really make sure comes across is that the new structure is not meant to supplant or, be better than the current structure. It really is designed to accommodate a certain subset of cases, because the overwhelming majority of cases within our current structure are handled just fine. It is those cases that get fairly contentious and adversarial when the current process, although most people wouldn't describe it this way, unfortunately, is really predicated on a collaborative, self-governing, cooperative process. I think the commission's recommendation was in large measure that we probably needed another avenue for those cases that don't quite fit in the current model. But to your question on metrics, one of the things that I think will be really interesting to kind of have a pulse on, a year or 2 years down the line, depending on how many cases come through, are kind of what are the characters of those cases that end up in the independent structure. So that maybe we can have a little bit, because right now it's an unknown what cases actually will end up in the new structure. So trying to metric that out. Another issue on timing, in the new structure, we do not have kind of the prescribed time periods that we have in the existing structure. So a notice of allegations goes out, you have certain amount of days to respond, et cetera. In the new structure, the chief panel member, who will serve as essentially the chair of the subset of the group of independent adjudicators for a particular case, will work with the complex case unit and the institution and the involved parties to set up a case management schedule at the outset of a case. So you would think that those time periods may not be as long as the time periods that are legislated in Article 19 in the existing process. And that will be another interesting thing to metric down the road, how those case management plans ended up working out, and did it really shorten the time periods where, any briefing would have to be submitted, or any the conclusion of an investigation had to be done by in this new independent process.
Real quick, for professionals who have been in our industry for years and have their eyes and ears open on this new process, directly, what would you say to them on what they can expect and what this is going to look like?
I think, again, this is likely, and my hope is that this is not going to subsume our existing process. This is really designed to capture those cases that are more nuanced, more contentious, where you don't have the level of agreement that you have between the enforcement staff and an institution and involved parties in the overwhelming majority of cases in our existing structure. And that this, with folks that are disconnected from our membership, this will have a level of separation, I think, that will ultimately allow for institutions to be held accountable in a slightly different way when they're not necessarily, when it's determined that they're not comporting with the mission and values of the association, as through the bylaws that are adopted by the membership. So I think that is what this process is going to be able to accommodate. Again, a small slither of those cases that just don't work in a process that was predicated on, being a collaborative process.
We're all interested to find out.
Absolutely. Thank you.